thinking it.
Well,
Like,
you know, when it rains, it pours. That's the bottom line. So, anyway, on a different note, play.
Yeah, there you go. When it rains, it pours.
Okay. Oh, we got to start over. Sorry.
We have started over.
Okay.
It's rolling, dude. Go. I think our church family loves you as much as we laugh and bloop as anybody else.
Yeah, I think our church family loves you as much as they will.
That's fair.
As much as they're going to.
Yeah, hey, listen, can't get any less. Can't get any less.
Well, I probably can't get any more.
That's fair. Hey, Connect Church, we're excited to learn in Bible study with you today. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 14. We encourage you to read through it before you listen to the lesson, but we're excited to have Will teach us today, and we'll be back afterwards to talk about how you can apply this passage to your life.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Will Taylor, and I'm so glad to have you with us here today. This week, we are again in Exodus talking about, you guessed it, the Exodus. Last week, Pastor Blaine talked to us in Exodus chapter 13 about the 10 plagues and about how God brought about the deliverance of Israel, specifically with the 10th plague, which started Passover, which continued Passover. And we saw that how God had provided for his people through the sacrificial system, and when the plague of the firstborns came through, how God protected really his firstborn people, the Israelites, and guided them out of Egypt, not only safely getting them out, but providing for them even financially with the looting, and lots of really rich story there. If you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to go back and watch that. This week in Exodus 14, we're going to be looking at how it shows us God's miraculous power. Sometimes we lose sight of all of our little daily trivial issues and problems and prayers. We lose sight of the magnificent, amazing power of the God that we serve. And so we're going to be looking at God's miraculous power and the fact that we can trust him through absolutely any circumstance. Now, I don't know about you, but I really appreciate a good suspenseful movie or even TV show. I remember when I was a kid, and this probably dates me, but one of my favorite shows to watch was a show called MacGyver. MacGyver was this guy who would get himself into these crazy situations, and no matter how nuts it seemed, no matter how dire the situation, no matter how impossible it was, he would be able to find some scrap or piece of metal or floss or whatever it was and rig up a tool or an explosion to get out of the situation. And it's one of those shows that you could watch over and over again, and you almost watch it and you know what's going to happen, but you just have to watch it just to make sure it's going to come out that way again. And there are lots of movies and books about that. There was a James Bond rerun the other day where this laser was just about to cut him in half. I mean, even the Mission Impossible series is called Mission Impossible. And I also remember growing up as a kid, Tolkien did this so well with his Hobbit and Lord of the Rings series. There are several high intensity situations where you're just on the edge of your seat reading. And if you haven't read them before, just thinking, what's going to happen? How are they going to get out of this situation? And that's what we have with the Israelites this week. If we have a truly impossible situation, if it weren't for God. So, in Exodus 14, I would encourage you to jump back a few verses to review. And in Exodus 13, it says that they were leaving Egypt, they were going out into the wilderness, and God is providing for them. God is showing them the way. And it says in verses 20 and 21 and 22 that God was with them with a pillar of cloud by day and by a pillar of fire at night, that he never left them. That this was, number one, reassurance of his presence and his provision, with no doubt shade during the hot days and light for security and warmth in cold desert nights. but also not just his presence, but his guide taking care of them. Then in verses chapter 14, in the first few verses, we see God speaking to Moses. And it says in verse 2, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You'll camp in front opposite Baal Zephon, opposite it by the sea. Now, what's important here is even before they get to this point, God was already providing for Israel. He had already, we already read in chapter 13 that he decided to send them this way, not another way, because he knew if they went this other way, they were going to run into some Philistines. Maybe not the Philistines you know, but some other Philistines who lived by the sea. They were mariners. And he knew that if these group of people who were not warriors, they were slaves, they were worn down, they were beaten by being slaves for hundreds of years, that they couldn't handle that. God knew that about them. And so he sent them this way. But God tells Moses in verse 3 that Pharaoh will regret his choices, and Pharaoh's heart will be hardened, and he's going to come after you. But it says in verse 4, says, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So important, so huge here that God is telling Moses, I want you in this exact place. Pharaoh's going to come, and he will know truly who I am. Absolutely huge. Then we move on to the particulars of what actually happened with Pharaoh in verses 5 through 9. We see that exactly what God said would happen happened. He started regretting that he had let go of his entire workforce. I mean, we're talking about 600,000 male slaves, around 2 million people total. So you talk about female slaves and children, and I mean, he's got a huge workforce that suddenly he doesn't have. And they walked out with most of their gold and valuables from the families that they were slaves for as well. And so he comes after them, and he comes after them hard. It says over 600 of his best chariots and the people riding them. This is an elite fighting force, one of the most powerful forces in the entire world, going after 2 million slaves walking across the desert on foot. And we see there was quite a bit of waffling with Pharaoh. He went back and forth a lot with the slaves, but I can't help but imagine that at this point he's thinking, I've got them. We've escaped it. The plagues are gone. Now I'm going to put an end to this. And so his heart was hardened. And if you have any confusion about what that means about God hardening his heart, Blaine, again, talked about this a little last week, but it's really best to think about it more along the lines of, because we know God gave us free will, but more along the lines of Pharaoh's heart was already headed there. His mind was already headed there. It's really more like God gave him the opportunity. God set the table because we knew that Pharaoh that was too good for him to pass up anyway. And so that's really kind of what that wording means. So they come after Israel. In verses 10, 11, and 12, we see that they can you imagine they start to see this huge dust cloud on the horizon as they're camped, maybe feel the thundering of the hooves, or they can hear it echoing across the desert dunes or across the wilderness. So what do? What would you do? Well, the first thing they do is they start to cry out to God. They are freaking out. And can you imagine the roller coaster they were on? From the high of escaping hundreds of years of slavery and walking out with all this gold and jewels and escaping that, and then coming down off of that. It kind of reminds me, the other day, our daughter had her first friend over for a sleepover, and they had an amazing time. They stayed up entirely too late. They ate too much junk food. They had a blast. But we all know what happens. Eventually, our friend has to go home. And as soon as her friend went home, our daughter could be seen not disrespectfully, but just kind of moping all around the house. We were doing some work out in the yard, and she was just had a very Charlie Brown posture to her. And we asked her about it, and she said she was just sad that her friend was gone. And both me and my wife knew exactly what she meant. She was coming down off those post-sleepover blues. She had those post-sleepover blues. She was coming down off I've been with my friend for like 48 hours and we had a blast that entire time. And now she's gone. And so that's kind of where the people of Israel were here. In verse 10 and 11, we see that when they heard it, they cried out. Now, some different people disagree about what this means. What I think it really means from my reading is that some of God's people did actually cry out to him. That some of God's people did genuinely say, God, help us. And the reason why I think this is when we look in Joshua 24:7, it talks about this, that God heard them and then he put the pillar of cloud in between them. That this was a direct response to them pleading to him. Some would say that it's not a real cry out. It's definitely open for interpretation. That's just kind of my view on it. However, some definitely didn't just cry out to God. We see in verses 11 and 12 that they're coming after Moses and they are coming after God, saying things like, you just brought us out here to die and it would have been better to stay slaves, etc., etc. And so how quickly we forget our deliverer, how quickly we turn on those who have taken care of us. You can just practically hear them saying, oh, I knew something like this was going to happen. I was looking at social media the other day after our big snow, and one of our city officials was just praising and lauding the highway department for all of their hard work. And then I read one comment, never read the comments. I read one comment from one person. It's like, oh, well, maybe they can finally fix the potholes now. And I just thought, come on, just enjoy this moment. Just be thankful for once. And so I can practically hear their voice saying that. Should have stayed in Egypt. And so here's the deal, guys. They were exactly where God wanted them. Our sailing in our life is not going to be smooth. It is going to be hard. If we see anything about following Christ in the Bible, it's not going to be rainbows and unicorns. It's not going to be hunky-dory. The Bible promises us we're going to run into difficult situations if we believe in him and we follow him. And something that Mom told me growing up, and I've told many students since then, is that life is a lot less about what happens to you and a lot more how you react to it. And so the issue isn't if we run into difficult situations, but how we respond to it. Will we complain and grumble, or will we genuinely cry out to God? Now, before we get into the second section, I did want to mention a couple of things. This is one of those stories that maybe we should revisit more as adults, as kids and children. And we go to Sunday school and children's church, we kind of get the kids' version, but there's some really deep application for us in our lives. And if you feel like you find yourself in between a desert and an army and the Red Sea, I would encourage you to do a couple of things. Number one, Pastor Blaine did do a sermon series a few years ago called Through Deserts and Seas, and I would encourage you to maybe try to look that up or ask somebody. I didn't ask any of the staff beforehand about this, but surely those are on tape or available somewhere. Second, I know that series was partly based upon Rob Morgan's book, who's a Free Baptist pastor in Nashville for many, many years now, called The Red Sea Rules, which is he based a very small, simple book on 10 things that we can learn about God, 10 rules that we can learn from the Israelites in this situation. You can't have this copy. This is my copy, but I'm sure it can be found for pennies on the dollar, used somewhere. But again, if you find yourself maybe struggling or going through difficult circumstances, check out those resources. This is something that should be gone over a lot more in depth than just a few minutes on one day. So, what do we see here as we finish out Exodus 14? Well, first, not only will we face seemingly impossible situations in our lives, but we have to remember that God has the power to see us through any of these difficulties. So, we left the children of Israel where Pharaoh and his armies had come. They're looking at the sea, they're looking at the armies, they're freaking out, they're losing their minds. What are they going to do? They're complaining about God, they're complaining to Moses. So, Moses' response, Exodus 14, verses 13 through 14. And it says this. It says, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not fear. Stand and see with the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen, you will never see them again. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent.'" Moses knew. God had told him. Moses had faith, and it was counted to him as righteousness. He knew that God's will was going to be done here. So he's assuring these people of this. We don't see it here, but obviously Moses is also praying to God as their spiritual leader. And then I love that of course praying to God was good, but Moses had multiple responsibilities. And so we see God in verse 15 tell Moses something funny. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Why are you crying out to me? Tell your sons of Israel to go.'" And so I love this. I love that he's like, yes, you've prayed. Yes, you're in your heart in the right place, but enough talk, Moses. It's time for action. Get your boots on. Let's go. And so we see that here. God telling Moses to get in the game. And he tells him to lift out his staff, stretch out his hand, and divide the sea. And then God tells Moses what his plan is. And what we have here is that, of course, their hearts will be hardened. Okay? And I love, this is not the first time and it's not the last time we've seen this. Don't miss it. Look at what verse 18 says. "The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." Guys, this is what it's about. Yes, God loves his people and wanted to save him. But why? It's because God wanted Israel to use Israel to let the whole world know about him. Everywhere he went, it was about him and his glory. It's about everybody knowing that God is God. And we can't lose sight of that. Yes, if we are following God, he's going to take care of us. Yes, he will provide for us. Yes, we have promises about him. But it's not about us. It's about his name and his glory. So, verse 19 and 20, we see what's probably a theophany, the angel of the Lord, or actually God's actual presence, and the pillar of cloud separate them. God is protecting them while the sea dries up. And then in verses 21 and 22, we see the sea actually divided. Now remember, we've got some Hollywood representations of this, where it's like kind of this alleyway of them walking through. Remember, this is probably over 2 million people. So this is not going to be just a little alleyway where they're going 2 by 2 like they did on the Noah's Ark. This is probably a pretty wide swath. So they walk through the Red Sea safely and protected. Then what happens? Well, what they knew was going to happen, what God and Moses knew was going to happen the whole time. The Egyptians pursue them. They get into going through the dry land. God causes and gives them confusion. Some places even say maybe storms or earthquakes or other things where they're just completely turned around and confused and bewildered. And God tells Moses to stretch out his hand, and the Egyptians are completely annihilated. They are completely wiped out. The Exodus had been complete. They were saved. God's name would be known through generations and generations for his provision. And that's the point. The entire next chapter, chapter 15, is immediately a song of praise about God's deliverance. But don't go too fast. Look at verses 30 and 31 to conclude the chapter. It says, "Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw them dead on the seashore." And here's the kicker, verse 31. "When Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They believed in the Lord and his servant Moses." And then we have this beautiful song of Moses exalting God's greatness and for his victory. So guys, I don't know what you're going through. I don't know where life leads you. If you're a student moving through school, a young adult trying to figure out life, maybe recovering from hurt in your life, maybe you're an empty nester, maybe you've got grandkids or great grandkids or whatever. It doesn't really matter where you are in any of those situations. You could be facing these difficulties, and you may be wondering, am I on the right path? Am I doing what I'm supposed to? Am I following God? But if we are being obedient to him, and if we are being sensitive to his voice and not hardening our heart like Pharaoh did, we can trust him and we can obey him, and he will see us through the difficult situations. And we can know that either he put us there right where he wants us, or he's allowed us to be there.
You know, I think that story never really gets old. There's only two types of story in the world. It's a story of salvation and a story of deliverance. And so when you read Exodus 14 and hear the teaching of it, never gets old because it's all of our stories. And we find that in the New Testament, that God uses their story as a story of us coming out of slavery and us being baptized through the sea and us being, delivered and living this life in the wilderness. And we're looking forward to the promised land. But I think about, so one of the takeaways that I got from this lesson is that even after deliverance, there's still hurdles and struggles that we have to go through.
Right.
There's still issues of life that have to be lived, and we still have to learn to obey him. Even after we're delivered, we have to still obey him, and there's going to be times where we really question our ability to trust him, or is he trustworthy? Mm-hmm. And that's a good reminder that he is always trustworthy, and like I believe you said last week, even when God is silent, he's still working. And when God causes us to jump over hurdles, he's still working. Right. He's not causing us to trip, he's causing us to grow.
Right.
And also having patience in that too, when it does feel like that, God isn't answering or God isn't there, to look back. If the Israelites would just said, well, you know what, he took care of that impossible situation. This is the next impossible situation. And again, it's really easy to look at the Israelites or even the disciples and get really, really frustrated sometimes until we look at our own lives and we start to go, oh, okay, yeah, I'm getting frustrated at the thing that I do.
You don't think it's easy too, when you're at work or you're out in society, it's really easy to judge someone else when they make decisions, right, until you look at your own life too, and you see we're all just the same people.
Yeah. I mean, even when you look back as a teenager, think about obedience. Mm-hmm. How obedient were we? I mean,
that's very obedient.
Think about that. Okay. Well, some people are, some people aren't. No, and then what happens? If you disobey, trust becomes the next issue. Mm-hmm. It does, with your family, with your parents, with your grandparents. It depends on no matter who you're living with. But disobedience leads to trust issues. Mm-hmm. And we see that even through this, where obedience plays a role, mm-hmm, trust plays a role, and
I think that's
all
great.
Of this.
Yeah, listen, I think that's great. So what I'm hearing you say is that when you start to disobey, the very thing. So we say, why am I disobeying? Well, because I distrust God. But the more that I disobey, the less I'm able to be trusted too. Mm-hmm. And when I am not trustworthy, I'm not real free to give away trust either. Isn't that weird?
Right.
It's like it's in a kingdom economy. If you invest it, you make it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think realizing that, again, you know, we like you said this earlier, we always give ourselves the benefit of the doubt and never anybody else. And it often seems the same thing with us. We'll give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, but we don't give God the benefit of the doubt. Not even that he needs the benefit of the doubt, because he doesn't fail. Like, it's not like, oh, well, he hasn't failed the last time. He has not failed. So it is easy to look at ourselves and give ourselves a lot of grace rather than other people. And again, I say God doesn't need grace, but to not go, oh, he's solid, he's fine, you know. So,
Yeah,
that's good.
And I thought something that was really very interesting to me that Will brought out that came from his mom. And he said this, he said, life is a lot less about what happens to you, a lot more about how you react to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went on to say, how do you respond to difficult situations?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I thought that was pretty good.
Well, I think when you experience it, and everybody's got different difficult situations. I mean, one thing is true, we all go through difficulty, but we all have, I mean, what's difficult for you may not be difficult to me because I've built muscle around it. What's difficult to me may not be difficult to you because God's prepared us for those moments. But what I've learned is that whoever you are truly at your core, whatever you've been investing in your life, that's how you'll respond to difficulty. So if you've been obeying God and you've been trusting God, difficulty's coming regardless. But when you've been investing in His sovereignty and who He is, then you'll respond with His character, nature, and difficulty. But if you've not been investing in Him, if you've not been obedient to Him and trusting Him, when difficulty comes, it'll shake you to the very core. And so these are a few things that we've been talking about and learning as we've studied Exodus 14 and really the whole redemptive story of Israel. And I hope that you're having these conversations in your life and in your home. And we would encourage you to have them in other people's homes as well. So if you'd like to be involved in a community group of inviting people even into your own home, talk to Blake about it. You can text him, email him, and we'll get you started in a community group too. Hope that you're inviting other people to watch this video and having conversations, sharing what God's doing and speaking into your life.
Have a wonderful week.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.